A group of young girls playing in the Melbourne suburb of South Yarra had no inkling of the deadly sexual predator watching them from a nearby hotel bar. His drink finished, the man approached one of the girls, 12-year-old Mina Griffiths, and proposed that she went for a walk with him. He took her to an abandoned house where he raped her. He strangled her, and then he stripped her dead body naked. Let's take a stab at this. Hi mates, and welcome to Something About Murder. I'm Jay Something, and every week I bring you a couple of cases from Australia's true crime history. If this sounds interesting to you, please help us out by shooting the like button with your trusty boomstick, stabbing that subscribe button, and also punching the notification bell in the face to be notified every time we release a new video. All of our episodes are released at the same time in podcast format on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or wherever you get your true crime podcast fix. Also, we now have Something About Murder merchandise, designed by myself, as well as Australian artist Redneck Kung Fu. There's just a few things here and there, but I'll put the link in the description. Captured in the 1930s, before the words psychopath and pedophile were part of common vernacular, notorious serial killer Arnold Sodeman murdered 4 young girls with little thought of remorse. Without guilt, the evil serial killer strangled them to death with their own clothing and left their small bodies alone in the Australian brush, earning himself a chilling name in another episode of Australian true crime. He's called the Schoolgirl Strangler. On Sunday the 10th of November 1930, 2 small boys entered a vacant house in Wheatley Road, Ormond, a suburb of Melbourne. To their horror, they found the body of a young girl, tied and gagged. She was face down on the floor. After their initial shock, the boys raced home and told their parents. Police and detectives were quickly on the scene. The girl's underclothing was used to tie her hands and ankles, and a gag had been thrust into her mouth. An autopsy revealed that she'd been strangled to death, and strangely, she'd been tied up after death. Detectives quickly established that the murdered girl was Mina Griffiths, aged 12 years, who had been reported missing the previous evening, Saturday. Investigations revealed that on Saturday, she'd been playing with a group of girls, including her 2 younger sisters, in Fawkner Park, not far from her home in South Yarra. A man, a stranger, approached Mina and asked if she would accompany him on a message, and she agreed. Mina's sister, 8-year-old Joyce, watching her sister walking across the park with a stranger, ran up to them and asked where they were going. Mina told her she was just going on a message with the stranger and she'd be back shortly. Her movements were traced to St Kilda, 3 kilometres from Fawkner Park, where the man bought her a parcel of fish and chips. Somehow, she was lured to the empty house in Ormond, 10 kilometres from Fawkner Park. Detectives brought hundreds of suspects into Russell Street Police Headquarters for questioning, but there was no evidence on which to make an arrest. 9 weeks after Mina's death, a 16-year-old girl, Hazel Wilson, left her home in Melton Drive, Ormond, to attend a dance with a friend. She failed to return home that night. Her brother Frank found her dead in a vacant block next day. Parts of her clothing were used to bind and gag her in similar circumstances to that of Mina Griffiths, although there was no evidence of sexual assault. The news of the murders eventually disappeared from the newspapers, but the police, now under pressure from their superiors, kept the files of the murders open. During the 1930s, Inverloch was rapidly becoming the most popular seaside town in South Gippsland. Situated on Anderson Inlet with its sheltered waters and safe sandy beaches within walking distance, Inverloch lured thousands of holidaymakers each year. The township consisted of 2 stores, a few shops, a police station, a post office, a school, a large public hall, and a garage to service the rapidly growing motor trade. A hotel and 2 guest houses catered for the holidaymakers who desired home comforts. SEC Power and Pipe Water was not connected to the town, but some buildings had their own generators for electricity and water from wells, and tank water was in plentiful supply. A bus service ran to Wonthaggi daily to connect with the Melbourne train. For the past years, Inverloch had become famous for its Regatta Day, which was held every New Year's Day. The organisers were hard at work early to ensure the program ran smoothly. Fun events included climbing the greasy pole, catching the greasy pig, sheaf tossing, whatever that is, nail driving, and foot races for all ages. A big attraction was the Bathing Beauty Contest, held near the pier, and another event that held interest was the Regatta Boat Parade, with the men and ladies parading their best finery. The shopkeepers were also about early, preparing for the arrival of thousands of day visitors. This was Inverloch's biggest trading day of the year, and big sales of food, ice cream, sweets, and beer were expected. Boiling water was also an important item, as customers queued all day to have their teapots and billy cans filled for sixpence. The day visitors began to arrive early to secure the best picnic spots. They came in all kinds of vehicles: horse-drawn, motorcars, farm trucks and tractors, and quite a few push bikes. The recent construction of all-weather roads leading into Inverloch from surrounding districts was a big improvement for motorists and other travellers, and encouraged more people to travel to the regatta. On arrival, families selected their picnic spot and spread their travelling rug on the ground and set up their picnic essentials. At the small settlement of Tarwin Meadows, 25 kilometres from Inverloch, Mr. and Mrs. Knights and family were preparing to make the trip to the Regatta Day. They invited Ethel Belshaw, a 12-year-old friend of their daughter Margaret, to come with them, as Ethel's parents were unable to make the trip. On reaching Inverloch, the girls played on the beach and watched the games and events. They made several visits to Mrs. Donohue's shop in Beach Road to purchase ice cream. Ethel and Margaret last visited the shop at about 4 p.m. Ethel was ahead of Margaret in the queue, and after buying her ice cream, she told Margaret she'd wait outside the shop for her. However, when Margaret left the shop a few minutes later, there was no sign of Ethel. When Ethel did not meet Mr. and Mrs. Knights at the arranged time, they were not worried at first, but as time went by, they became anxious, and then they contacted police. A search party was organised by residents, assisted by campers. They searched the beach and scrub all night without success. The search was resumed the next morning, the 2nd of January, and within a few minutes, the secretary of the Wonthaggi RSL found Ethel's body in a small clearing of a well-defined track near the beach end of Pier Road. Ethel's body was face down, and her hands and legs were tied. The local police were soon at the murder scene, and homicide detectives arrived later in the day. Indigenous trackers were also brought to the murder site, but rain, which had fallen during the night, made their task difficult, as it obliterated tracks that may have been useful. The trackers did find a place a few metres from where the body was found, where a struggle had occurred. Forensic police visited the spot where the body was found and examined it before it was taken in the Wonthaggi morgue for a post-mortem examination by the government pathologist, Dr. Mollison. Dr. Mollison found that one of the girl's stockings was tied tightly around her neck. The other stocking was rammed down her throat and completely blocked her windpipe. There were other marks to show that the murdered girl had been roughly handled by her assailant. Robert Belshaw, the father of the dead girl, was attending the Scout World Jamboree in Frankston as a lone scout when he was told of the tragic news. He immediately returned to Tarwin Meadows to be with his wife, who was in deep shock. Robert then gave evidence of identification before the coroner at the Wonthaggi Hospital. He told the coroner that the murdered girl was 12 years and 8 months old, of medium build, fair complexion, and possessed beautiful thick hair to her waist. She was wearing a knee-length white Fuji silk frock with a blue cloth belt, brown stockings and tan shoes. She looked 1 or 2 years older than her actual age. Police and detectives interviewed hundreds of residents and holidaymakers and appealed for information, but only a few came forward. Mrs. Evans, whose house adjoined the dense patch of scrub where the girl's body was found, was adamant that she heard screams coming from the scrub about 140 metres away at 8:15 p.m. While detectives did not disregard Mrs. Evans' story, they believe the death occurred between 6:30 p.m. and 7 p.m. Nurse Elmore of Corranborough made a statement that she saw a girl closely resembling Ethel Belshaw walking along the Leongatha Road about 6 p.m. on New Year's Day. She was walking with a young man. Investigations reached a dead end. As each day went by, detectives and police, despite travelling hundreds of kilometres to surrounding districts and interviewing thousands of people, were no nearer to a solution. To add to their frustration, people were critical of their performance in not solving the crime. It was obvious that the unsolved Ormond murders 4 years previously were likely linked to the same murderer, and that he was still at large. Detectives were accumulating evidence that Ethel knew her assailant, so they went to Tarwin Meadows to try and find any clues that could solve the crime. They found that Ethel seldom left Tarwin Meadows, which comprised about 40 people, most of whom worked for George Black as share farmers. Ethel was of an unusually retiring disposition and lived with her family in one of the clusters of red cottages which stand on the Green Flat. One of her principal interests, in spite of her age, was her doll collection. Her school was in a building which was used in turn as school, church and social hall. She was acquainted with boys of the district, but as far as her father knew, she had no friendships with them. Her father said that Ethel was a very quiet and obedient girl, and she never moved from the house without being accompanied by her elder sister, aged 19 years, or her brother, aged 11 years. Her father particularly warned her of the dangers of having anything to do with strange men. Would this shy girl, making her first visit to Inverloch for more than a year, have consented to walk away into a lonely area with a strange man? Indigenous trackers had confirmed there was no sign of a struggle along the track except where her body was found, substantiating the police theory that she walked from the shop with somebody she knew. Many holidaymakers, fearing the killer was still in Inverloch, kept a strict watch over their children, and they never had the free run of the beach and bush as they had previously. The funeral of Ethel Belshaw was held on Friday afternoon, the 4th of January 1935. Representatives of almost every family in Tarwin Meadows and Tarwin Lower were among those who attended. The cortege of more than 30 cars moved slowly up the hill to where the Tarwin Lower Cemetery is located. Pupils from the Tarwin Meadows State School lined the road as the hearse passed, and then marched into the cemetery. Robert Belshaw and his wife, their 2 daughters aged 19 and 3, and a son aged 11, were the main mourners. In Inverloch, the police and detectives worked long hours following the leads available to them, but without success. After a few weeks, the township returned to normal, and the unsolved murder was no longer a news item in the daily papers. The police found the most baffling aspect of the case was that nobody came forward with information from the time Ethel left the shop after buying her ice cream and presumably walking away with her murderer. Police thought her conspicuous waist-length fair hair would have held attention in the crowd. Inspector Superintendent O'Keefe was in charge of the investigation, and he worked his men hard to try and solve this frustrating case. On the evening of the 1st of December 1935, a 6-year-old girl was reported missing to the Leongatha police. Her name was June Rushmore, and she'd been playing in a recreation reserve and began to walk home in the late afternoon. Her body was found by searchers in McPherson's Lane, about a kilometre away from her home. Her death was caused by strangulation, and the body was bound and gagged in the same fashion as the other 3 victims. Detectives from Melbourne immediately raced to Leongatha to investigate this now familiar pattern of murder. 2 boys came forward and said they saw a man near the scene of the murder. He was pedalling a push bike and wore a dark suit. The boys could not identify him as it was almost dark at the time. Once again, the detectives were frustrated, as this was the Great Depression era and thousands of people owned push bikes similar as their only mode of transport. Thousands of people were unemployed during the Depression years and would accept any kind of work to earn money. One such person was Arnold Karl Sodeman. Arnold was born on the 12th of December 1899 in Hawthorne, and he was the son of Karl Sodeman, a German-born engineer, and his Australian wife Violet. As a child, he was treated severely by his father and frequently witnessed Karl beating Violet. Aged 13, Arnold ran away from home and worked in the coal mines in Wonthaggi. In his youth, Sodeman was twice brought before the courts to answer criminal charges, and at 17 he was convicted of theft and forgery and sent to a reformatory. After his release, he and another man held up the station master at Surrey Hill Station. A shot was fired, and the station master was wounded. Sodeman was caught and convicted and sentenced to 3 years hard labour at Pentridge Prison. He was later transferred to the French Island Prison in Western Port Bay. However, he escaped from there but was soon recaptured. Another year was added to his existing sentence. Sodeman was released from prison in 1926 and settled down and married his doll, Bernice Pope. The couple had a daughter, Joan, in 1928. The marriage was a happy one, although Sodeman seemed to suffer from occasional bouts of depression and frequent drunkenness. He was never violent to his family. Shortly after marriage, the Great Depression arrived, causing mass unemployment. Sodeman, his wife and daughter travelled around the countryside looking for odd jobs. And at one stage, he lived in Ormond. At the time Ethel Belshaw was murdered, the Sodeman family were living in a rented cottage in Leongatha, 25 kilometres from Inverloch. He was employed as a labourer in a roadwork gang. After the death of Ethel Belshaw, Sodeman was one of thousands questioned by the police. At this point, the police were unaware of his criminal record. He was always a quietly spoken man and was not easily upset. Sodeman's reaction to a workmate's remark during a tea break at Dundalk aroused suspicion. The workmate was reading a paper which read that the police were looking for a man with a pushbike. The workmate suggested jokingly that Sodeman had a pushbike. Could have been him that was near the scene of the Leongatha murder. Sodeman glared at his fellow worker and strode away in a rage after throwing the contents of his mug away. This was quite out of character for the quietly spoken man. The next day, one of the workmen reported the incident to the police. Detectives who went to the campsite brought Sodeman in for questioning in their temporary headquarters at Leongatha. After hours of questioning, Sodeman broke down and told of the murder. He was cycling back to Dundalk after spending the weekend at his home in Leongatha when he saw June Rushmore walking towards her home. The child knew him and he offered her a lift on his bike. After a short distance, he stopped the bike and said she could walk the rest of the way. She continued on foot and Sodeman ran after her. She became afraid and ran into the bushes. Sodeman then described how he grabbed her around the neck and she started to scream. He strangled her and then used a belt to hold a gag in her mouth after she went limp. He also bound her after her death. Sodeman also gave details of the 3 previous murders of Mina Griffiths, Hazel Wilson and Ethel Belshaw. Sodeman gave a detailed statement to police, revealing the mania that often controlled his actions. He told of his relief that his campaign of violence had finished. "I realise it must end," he stated. "If it was to go on tomorrow, it would happen again. Life is no use to me or to anybody else. The sooner I go through the drop, the better," referring to his expected execution by hanging. The people who knew the quietly spoken Sodeman could not believe that he could commit such crimes. His wife and daughter were devastated. And sitting in his Pentridge jail cell, Sodeman also had other unfinished business: to declare his guilt to his distressed wife of 10 years, Bernice, who held out some hope that he might be innocent. Sodeman also wanted her forgiveness. In a short but heartfelt letter, the serial killer, known widely as the Schoolgirl Strangler, laid bare his love and devotion to his wife and his daughter Joan. Addressing Bernice as doll, Sodeman asked her to not put any of the family funds towards his legal defence. "I will plead guilty, and I want you to put all of the money available to your own and Joan's use," he wrote. Sodeman also said that he contacted the Shire, his employer, asking for his wages to be paid directly to her. "May God be always with you, and forgive me for what I have done," he closed. A fortnight later, on the 13th of January 1936, his wife replied, bluntly asking Sodeman if he had, in fact, killed the 4 females. "I'm writing to ask you do one thing for me, and that is to tell me the absolute truth," she wrote. "If you have done this thing, don't let me battling in the dark. I know in your right mind you could never have heard anything, but you must know, and only you. I try hard to convince myself this is a mistake, so play fair and tell me the truth. It will not make the least bit of difference, as my sympathy will always be with you. You must realise that if those turns came on you before, they would do so again, unless you have treatment, and you would only be a worry to yourself. You know how dearly we loved our girlie. You must know that others love theirs just as much. Just think how we would have felt if it had been our little one. Your love for your own kid should help you to realise those things. I need my health to look after our daughter, as there is no one else, as you know. It's the uncertainty of the thing that is driving me to distraction. So please, Arnold, tell me the truth. If the kid was on your bike, then the fingerprints will be there and nothing can disprove it. Think carefully, and please, Arnold, let me know." He said the drink had sent him over the edge, which he described as having urged him towards this dreadful craze to destroy. "I have tried and tried, as you know, to give up drink altogether, but through some weakness, I always give way to the drink again," he wrote. "Dear doll, you now know why I used to sit hour after hour by the fire, apparently dreaming. I was fighting against this thing, afraid that it would eventually turn my brain. I think there is something wrong inside, and when I take drink, I am then unable to keep it under control. Dear doll, be brave, for yours and Joan's sake. My only regrets and sorrow are for all those who have suffered through my maniacal madness. Well, dear, I do not feel that I am able to write any more at present, so will close with love to Joan and you. Sodeman was only charged with the murder of June Rushmore, and the trial opened at the Melbourne Criminal Court on the 17th of February 1936. The defence counsel pleaded insanity after it was found that Sodeman's father and grandfather died in mental asylums. However, the jury found Sodeman guilty and the judge sentenced him to death. Sodeman had not wanted a reprieve because of the fear that if he lived, he may well have committed more murders. Sodeman spent a good deal of his time playing drafts with Edward Cornelius, who was under sentence of death for the murder of Reverend Cecil in Fitzroy in November of the previous year. Arnold Sodeman was hanged and buried at Pentridge Prison, Coburg, on the 1st of June 1936. An autopsy disclosed that he was suffering from leptomeningitis, a degenerative disease which could cause serious congestion of the brain when aggravated by alcohol. As usual with executed prisoners, Sodeman was buried at Pentridge in an unmarked grave. After Arnold's hanging, Bernice Sodeman reverted to her maiden name of Pope, such was the public hatred of her husband. Bernice started anew and lived for another 45 years until her death in a Rye nursing home. Police said Bernice was shocked after the revelations of her husband's violent crimes. Joan, now in her 80s, lives in a Melbourne retirement home. Thanks for your time today. I really appreciate you watching the whole video. Join me next time as we trawl through another episode in the true crime history of Australia. If you've enjoyed this video, once again, please go ahead and shoot the like button with your trusty broomstick and stab that subscribe button. Make sure you also punch the notification bell in the face so that you can get notified every time we release a new video. It really helps us out. And remember, all of our episodes are released at the same time on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts from. And I'm on Instagram at somethingaboutmurder, and I respond to every message I receive. So I hope to hear from you, and I hope you don't get murdered. Stay safe out there. Bye.